George W. Bush is the 43rd President of the United States. He was sworn into office on January 20, 2001, re-elected on November 2, 2004, and sworn in for a second term on January 20, 2005. Prior to his presidency, President Bush served for 6 years as the 46th governor of the state of Texas, where he earned a reputation for bipartisanship and as a compassionate conservative who shaped public policy based on the principles of limited government, personal responsibility, strong families, and local control. President Bush was born on July 6, 1946, in New Haven, Connecticut, and grew up in Midland and Houston, Texas. He received a bachelor's degree in history from Yale University in 1968, and then served as an F-102 fighter pilot in the Texas Air National Guard. President Bush received a Master of Business Administration from Harvard Business School in 1975. Following graduation, he moved back to Midland and began a career in the energy business. After working on his father's successful 1988 presidential campaign, President Bush assembled the group of partners who purchased the Texas Rangers baseball franchise in 1989. On November 8, 1994, President Bush was elected governor of Texas. He became the first governor in Texas history to be elected to consecutive 4-year terms when he was re-elected on November 3, 1998. Since becoming President of the United States in 2001, President Bush has worked with the Congress to create an ownership society and build a future of security, prosperity, and opportunity for all Americans. He signed into law tax relief that helps workers keep more of their hard-earned money, as well as the most comprehensive education reforms in a generation, the No Child Left Behind Act of 2001. This legislation is ushering in a new era of accountability, flexibility, local control, and more choices for parents, affirming our nation's fundamental belief in the promise of every child. President Bush has also worked to improve health care and modernize Medicare, providing the first-ever prescription drug benefit for seniors, increase homeownership, especially among minorities, conserve our environment, and increase military strength, pay, and benefits. Because President Bush believes the strength of America lies in the hearts and souls of our citizens, he has supported programs that encourage individuals to help their neighbors in need. On the morning of September 11, 2001, terrorists attacked our nation. Since then, President Bush has taken unprecedented steps to protect our homeland and create a world free from terror. He is grateful for the service and sacrifice of our brave men and women in uniform and their families. The President is confident that by helping build free and prosperous societies, our nation and our friends and allies will succeed in making America more secure and the world more peaceful. President Bush is married to Laura Welch Bush, a former teacher and librarian, and they have twin daughters, Barbara and Jenna. The Bush family also includes 2 dogs, Barney and Miss Beasley, and a cat, Willie. George W. Bush, the 43rd President of the United States, led the country during a time of great challenge and change. The terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001, the global war on terror, the war in Iraq, and the economic downturn of 2008 are just some of the major events that Bush had to contend with during his time in office. At different times, President Bush was both the most popular president and one of the least popular presidents in American history, and his administration sparked both passionate defenders and vehement critics. His presidency will continue to be studied and debated for years to come. When George W. Bush took office in 2001, he became only the second president of the United States whose father had also been president. George H.W. Bush served in office from 1989 to 1993, and John Adams and John Quincy Adams were both presidents in the early 1800s. George W. Bush was also one of the few presidents to win office despite losing the popular vote. Interestingly, John Quincy Adams also won the presidency without winning the popular vote. George W. Bush was born on July 6, 1946, the first child of George Herbert Walker and Barbara Bush. The young Bush greatly admired his father and followed in his footsteps throughout much of his life, including serving as President of the United States. Bush was not an exceptional student but attended some of the premier educational establishments in the United States, including Phillips Academy, Andover, Yale University, and Harvard University. Bush served as a pilot in the Texas Air National Guard during the Vietnam War, but remained in the United States and saw no combat. After a number of short-term jobs, Bush landed a position with an oil company in the 1970s and eventually established his own energy company before going on to be part owner of the Texas Rangers baseball club. He married Laura Welch in 1977, and they had twin daughters, Jenna and Barbara, in 1981. As president, Bush was known for his evangelical Christian faith, but that faith, and the sobriety that accompanied it, did not come until he was in his 40s. Bush made his first run for public office in 1978, but failed to win the congressional seat he sought. He did not run for political office again until his father had left the presidency. In 1993, Bush challenged the popular Democratic governor of Texas, Ann Richards. Focusing on education, juvenile justice, welfare, and tort reform, Bush's victory stunned much of the nation. He won re-election for governor by a landslide in 1998, and that victory helped launch him into the 2000 race for the presidency. Bush defeated Senator John McCain of Arizona for the Republican nomination and then went on to win a controversial and disputed victory over Vice President Al Gore in November. Although Gore won the popular vote nationwide by more than 500,000 ballots, Bush tallied the constitutionally required 270 electoral college votes by winning a few hundred more popular votes in Florida after a contested recount. The election spurred weeks of litigation, ultimately settled by the U.S. Supreme Court, making it one of the most controversial elections in American history. George W. Bush launched his administration against one of the most polarized political landscapes in recent memory. The Republicans were eager to reclaim the White House after 8 years of the contentious Clinton administration, and many Democrats did not consider Bush to be a legitimately elected president. Bush's compassionate conservative philosophy defined his approach to domestic policy. It utilized traditional tenets of conservatism, such as small government and free market principles, to help people help themselves, and local groups such as churches to help those who could not help themselves. Among his initiatives, President Bush created the Office of Faith-Based and Community Initiatives to allow religious organizations to work with government to address social problems. Among his top priorities, Bush succeeded in getting Congress to pass the No Child Left Behind Act in 2001 with bipartisan support. The law raised national education standards and allocated funding according to test results, but was not without its controversy because of its reliance on testing and the weakening of local autonomy. Bush's health care initiative, the Medicare Modernization Act of 2003, established prescription drug benefits for seniors and created health savings accounts. It also sought to provide a more competitive market for Medicare services. Beginning in 2003, Bush began pursuing the partial privatization of the Social Security system, a controversial and ultimately unsuccessful initiative. President Bush's economic policy reflected hands-off conservative supply-side theory. One of his major domestic accomplishments in his first term was garnering congressional support for $1.35 trillion in tax cuts, but only at the expense of making them temporary rather than permanent in the tax code. Although he inherited the beginnings of an economic slowdown, by 2007 the stock market topped 14,164, more than 6,000 points higher than it had been 5 years earlier, and unemployment fell to 4.7%. Government expenditures kept growing, however, as tax revenue declined, moving the government from a balanced budget to huge budget deficits. In the fall of 2008, and in the middle of the presidential campaign to replace President Bush, the economy imploded as the bubble of housing prices collapsed and financial institutions began to fail. The stock market crashed, prompting an economic situation that came to be known as the Great Recession. The most transformative event of the Bush presidency occurred on September 11, 2001. Islamic terrorists from a group called Al-Qaeda succeeded in a coordinated attack using airliners as missiles, crashing into the Pentagon, collapsing the Twin Towers in New York City, downing a plane in Pennsylvania, and killing nearly 3,000 people. The events of that day moved Bush from a president concerned with compassionate conservative solutions at home to one focused intensely on threats from abroad. He also went from a president some considered illegitimately elected and unpopular to becoming, for a time, the most popular president in American history. After the attacks, Bush spoke for an angry and mourning nation, and he became a rallying point for the American people. As he recalled in his autobiography, Decision Points, in a single morning, the purpose of my presidency had grown clear: to protect our people and defend our freedom that had come under attack. After the terrorist attacks on New York and Washington, D.C., President Bush addressed a joint session of Congress, on September 20, 2001, and laid out what became known as the Bush Doctrine: our war on terror begins with Al-Qaeda, but it does not end there. It will not end until every terrorist group of global reach has been found, stopped, and defeated. He went further: from this day forward, any nation that continues to harbor or support terrorism will be regarded by the United States as a hostile regime. In his remarks, Bush was indicating that war in Afghanistan was imminent as the terrorists of 9/11 were trained and harbored in that rugged Islamic nation. On October 7, 2001, coordinated American military attacks began in Afghanistan against Al-Qaeda terrorist training camps and military installations of the Taliban regime, which had supported Al-Qaeda. The Taliban was quickly driven from power, and members of Al-Qaeda fled into the mountains or across the borders to find refuge. What seemed like a quick and easy war against a third-world nation and terrorist group, however, would become the longest war in American history. The U.S. mission evolved from one of dismantling terrorist cells in the region to bolstering civil society and installing a new democratically elected government in Afghanistan. Once the Taliban was in retreat, Bush and his advisors returned to their long-standing concerns about the dangers of Iraq and its leader Saddam Hussein. Vice President Dick Cheney summed up the administration's case in a speech on August 26, 2002, at the Veterans of Foreign Wars National Convention. He declared, simply stated, "There is no doubt that Saddam Hussein now has weapons of mass destruction. There is no doubt that he is amassing them to use them against our friends, against our allies, and against us." After the administration's public education effort, Congress authorized the president to use force against Iraq if he found it necessary. On March 19, 2003, U.S. and British forces launched a series of strikes on government installations and other targets in Iraq. A ground invasion followed soon after. Although the regime collapsed quickly and the United States won decisive victories on the battlefield, Iraq soon descended into sectarian violence with U.S. forces caught in the middle of a civil war for control of the country. Despite all the assurances from the Bush administration, based on intelligence from the world's spy agencies, no weapons of mass destruction were found in Iraq. The war there became deeply unpopular with the American public as American casualties mounted, and there seemed to be no good solution on the horizon. As a result, President Bush's popularity sagged. Although initially very popular, Bush's actions in the war on terror became some of his most controversial acts as president. His administration established military tribunals for captured terrorists, approved a list of enhanced interrogation techniques, and instituted the Terrorist Surveillance Program, TSP, to scour domestic communications. Congress established a new Department of Homeland Security, passed the Patriot Act, and authorized war against all those who orchestrated the 9/11 attacks or who might plan future attacks. Vice President Cheney, along with so-called neoconservatives in the Bush administration, counseled a very aggressive approach to the post-9/11 world. Many opponents vehemently disagreed with the administration's policies. The Bush presidency began with conservative reform goals, such as lowering taxes, but became better known as the presidency that prosecuted America's war on terror. The September 11, 2001, attacks changed the entire focus of the Bush administration. The long, hard wars in Afghanistan and Iraq cost thousands of U.S. lives, billions of dollars, and damaged Bush's popularity as president. He ended his time in office with low job approval, and with Republicans losing control of Congress in the 2006 elections and the White House in the 2008 election. After Bush won re-election as governor of Texas in 1998 with a resounding victory, many national political figures urged him to run for the presidency. On the morning of his second inauguration as governor of Texas, Bush told his mother that he was still struggling with the decision. She was not sympathetic, suggesting that her son should simply decide. The church sermon that day described the calling of Moses by God to lead his people from Egypt. During the service, Bush's mother leaned toward him and said, "He is talking to you." The sermon concluded with a message about the opportunity that each individual has to find his calling. Bush felt a calm confidence that he was meant to run for president and authorized Karl Rove to begin preparing for a national campaign. National name recognition, family connections, and fundraising ability made Bush a strong presidential candidate. During the Iowa caucuses, however, his campaign hit some rough spots. When he was asked which political philosopher he most identified with, Bush replied, "Christ, because he changed my heart." The answer caused consternation in the national press but seemed to play well in Iowa, especially among evangelical Christians, and Bush placed first in the caucuses. In New Hampshire, the competition stiffened, led by Senator John McCain of Arizona. His candidacy appealed to many moderate and independent voters, which outnumbered Bush's more conservative supporters in the Granite State. McCain, a political maverick, touted new ideas for reform, in contrast to Bush, whom he portrayed as part of the establishment. McCain defeated Bush in New Hampshire, forcing Bush to regroup, with his wife urging him never to allow someone else to define him again. Rather than blaming his staff, Bush took personal responsibility for the loss and told them that they would finish the race as a team. He was still confident in his candidacy. The focus then turned to South Carolina, where the Bush campaign chose a new theme, reformer with results, in order to counter McCain by bringing attention to Bush's bipartisan accomplishments as governor of Texas. The campaign shifted to expanding grassroots efforts and holding more town hall meetings. Bush won the crucial southern state with 53% of the vote. The momentum gained in South Carolina, and his extensive grassroots efforts, carried him to victory in 9 of 13 primary states on Super Tuesday. Bush was able to ride this wave of support to the Republican nomination. As his primary victory became secure, Bush turned to the important task of finding a running mate. He sent his campaign manager, Joe Albaugh, to Dallas for a meeting with his father's old friend and former Secretary of Defense, Dick Cheney. Albaugh's task was to determine if Cheney was interested in being a candidate for vice president, and, if not, whether he was willing to find a running mate for Bush. Cheney passed on the vice presidency but offered to lead a search committee. Bush later wrote that he was seeking someone with whom I was comfortable, someone willing to serve as part of a team, someone with the Washington experience that I lacked, and most important, someone prepared to serve as president at any moment. By early summer, Bush had a list of finalists, but his sights were still set on Cheney. He decided to make another try for the elder statesman, who finally agreed to serve. Cheney brought little, if any, political benefit to the Bush campaign because Cheney's home state of Wyoming only cast 3 electoral college votes and consistently voted Republican anyway. Bush's top campaign staffers, including Karl Rove, opposed the Cheney choice. Bush, however, saw the value of having a veteran Washington insider and experienced politician by his side. The 2000 Republican National Convention was held in Philadelphia, where Bush delivered a stirring speech that reflected his reasons for pursuing the presidency. "Our opportunities are too great, our lives too short to waste this moment. So tonight, we vow to our nation, we will seize this moment of American promise. We will use these good times for great goals. This Clinton-Gore administration had its moment. They had their chance. They have not led. We will. 2 months after the convention, Bush entered his first debate with Democratic nominee, Vice President Al Gore. Like Bush, Gore hailed from a family with a history of political involvement and had an Ivy League pedigree. In addition to his service as vice president during Clinton's 2 terms, Gore, a former U.S. Senator, was also an experienced debater. The high expectations for Gore helped Bush. As long as Bush did not commit any major mistakes, he would surpass the public's expectations for him. Moderated by PBS's veteran anchorman Jim Lehrer, the first debate between Bush and Gore took place in Boston. Bush made a consistent effort to paint Gore as a Washington, D.C. insider who made big promises and showed few results. Gore attempted to portray Bush as a friend of the rich with little experience in governing, especially at the federal level. Neither candidate committed any major gaffes, and both hewed to their prepared scripts. Inexplicably, Gore audibly sighed at several of Bush's responses. Violating the debate rules, the vice president frequently interrupted his opponent. Gore's tactics seemed overeager and unprofessional. The second and third debates went smoothly, without major gaffes from either candidate. Polls suggested that Bush benefited more from the televised debates, showing that voters felt better about a Bush presidency than a Gore administration. Governor Bush felt optimistic about his chances before advisor and confidant Karen Hughes approached him 5 days before the election with news that a reporter had discovered a drunk driving citation Bush had received years ago. Bush had considered disclosing the DUI earlier in his political career but decided against it because, as he claimed, he did not want his daughters to know about his irresponsible behavior. Not disclosing the DUI on my terms may have been the single costliest political mistake I ever made, Bush later wrote. Laura called their daughters to inform them of the announcement before they found out from television news. Bush issued a pithy statement, "I was pulled over. I admitted to the policeman that I had been drinking. I paid a fine. And I regret that it happened. But it did. I've learned my lesson." Bush worried that he might have cost himself the presidency. Karl Rove estimated that approximately 3 million people, especially evangelical Christians, stayed home or changed their vote following the disclosure. During the 5 days following the announcement, Bush lost the 4-point lead he had held in the polls. He campaigned hard for the last week and entered Election Day with the race too close to call. On election night, the major news networks initially called the key battleground states of Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Florida for Gore. Florida's polls had not even closed, and Karl Rove adamantly maintained that the early call was flawed. At about 10 p.m. Eastern Time, CNN and CBS rescinded their early call of Florida, and at about 2:15 a.m., the networks revised their call of the race in Florida in favor of Bush. Shortly after the Florida switch, Gore phoned Bush to concede. Gore had about 15 minutes to address his supporters before Bush would speak to the crowd waiting outside the state capitol in Austin, Texas. The allotted time passed without a concession speech from Gore. Bush's brother, Governor Jeb Bush of Florida, checked the networks to find that the margin in Florida was narrowing once again. Subsequently, Bush spoke with Gore again via phone, and in a terse conversation, Gore told Bush that he was retracting his concession as the numbers in Florida kept changing. By 4:30 in the morning, the Bush campaign discovered that Gore had sent a team of lawyers to Florida to oversee a recount of the votes. Bush was advised to send an emissary as well and dispatched Washington powerhouse and former Secretary of State, James Baker, a veteran of the Reagan and Bush 41 administrations. Pending the election results, Bush returned home to his ranch in Crawford, Texas, where he avoided television coverage of the recount process. He tried to relax, frequently taking long runs. After weeks of legal battles and recounts, the Florida Supreme Court ruled 4-3 in favor of Gore's plea for a selective recount. Bush then appealed to the United States Supreme Court. On December 12, the High Court ruled in Bush v. Gore. By a vote of 7-2, they found that Florida's inconsistent recount process violated the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution's 14th Amendment. By a 5-4 decision, the court ruled that there was no fair way to recount the votes in Florida in time for the state's votes to be counted in the Electoral College. The election results would stand. By just a few hundred votes, Bush had won Florida and with it the presidency. He had wanted to share the victory in Austin with his 20,000 supporters waiting on election night, but, as he wrote, he probably became the first person to learn he had won the presidency while lying in bed with his wife watching TV. The national spectacle of the Florida recounts, with its disputed ballots, hanging chads, and determinative Supreme Court ruling, undermined Bush's wish to start his presidency with a strongly united nation. While he won an Electoral College victory 271 to 266, Gore won 500,000 more popular votes from the American people than the victor. Many considered Bush's election to be illegitimate, and the Congressional Black Caucus even protested during the official counting of the ballots on the floor of the House of Representatives. It was a less than auspicious start for any new presidency. The re-election race of 2004. 4 years later, Bush faced U.S. Senator John Kerry, a Democrat from Massachusetts. A decorated Vietnam War veteran who had seen combat as a swift boat captain, Kerry became a leader of the anti-war movement once he left the Navy. Bush focused on Kerry's liberal voting record in the Senate, including a vote against an $87 billion bill to fund the war on terror. Bush chose to highlight this choice in his ads, leading Kerry to respond, "I actually did vote for the $87 billion before I voted against it." Bush saw the opportunity to attack Kerry as a flip-flopper. Kerry, on the other hand, attacked Bush as an unqualified commander-in-chief, who tricked the American people into an ill-conceived and unpopular war in Iraq. He pledged to the Democratic National Convention and a national televised audience that he would be a commander-in-chief who will never mislead us into war. To drive the image home, he highlighted his wartime experience in Vietnam, saluting and declaring that he was reporting for duty, a line that garnered much popular criticism. Bush experienced a Vietnam-era controversy of his own during the 2004 campaign when CBS reporter Dan Rather aired allegations that Bush did not fulfill his duties in the Texas Air National Guard, which later proved to be based on false reports and forged documents. Along with making a strong case against a John Kerry presidency, Bush focused his campaign on showing that he could continue to lead the nation on major issues. For his second term, he pledged to modernize Social Security, reform the immigration system, and overhaul the tax code, while continuing No Child Left Behind and the faith-based initiative, implementing Medicare reform, and above all, fighting the war on terror. The two candidates debated 3 times during the fall campaign. Kerry was aggressive, particularly in the first debate, which caught Bush by surprise. Networks showed split-screen images of Bush reacting to Kerry's charges in that first debate, and the president appeared arrogant and disdainful. Bush corrected his expressions in the next 2 debates, while Kerry committed a major gaffe on a question about homosexuality when he cited the fact that Vice President Cheney's daughter is a lesbian. Critics derided Kerry for gratuitously dragging the vice president's family into the campaign. Election day started with a shockwave through the campaigns and the media. According to exit polls, the president was doing poorly, even in strong Republican states such as Mississippi and South Carolina. Although they could not yet share their findings publicly, it was clear the media were bracing for a major upset. Bush's chief strategist, Karl Rove, however, was convinced the methodology of the exit polls had to be wrong and, in the end, he was correct. The election would come down to the swing states of Iowa, New Mexico, Nevada, and Ohio. Though they were close, the Bush team became convinced they had won all 4 and, with them, the presidency. At about 4 in the morning, however, rumors began circulating that Kerry and Edwards would file a lawsuit over the results in Ohio. Provisional ballots had not been counted in the state by the end of election night, leaving the results in some doubt. Consequently, Bush chose not to declare victory and again denied his supporters, gathered near the White House, a chance to celebrate. Bush sent Chief of Staff Andy Card to explain. President Bush decided to give Senator Kerry the respect of more time to reflect on the results of this election. We are convinced that President Bush has won re-election with at least 286 electoral votes. Kerry called the next morning to concede. In the end, Bush won 286 electoral college votes to Kerry's 251, along with 50.73% of the popular vote. Having lost the popular vote in 2000, this majority, bare though it was, added some popular legitimacy to the Bush presidency and gave him confidence he could focus on his domestic policy goals. Bush declared that he had earned political capital from the campaign and now he intended to spend it. His hopes, however, were soon dashed. The Iraq War grew more unpopular as the insurgency escalated and American causalities continued to mount. The government's seemingly inept reaction to the decimation caused by 2005's Hurricane Katrina, the costliest natural disaster in U.S. history, further detracted from the president's popularity. A series of scandals involving Republican politicians also undermined the party's support. The 2006 midterm elections were a disaster for President Bush and his party as they lost control of both houses of Congress and a majority of governorships across the nation. Bush's legislative agenda never recovered. George W. Bush was 62 years old when his presidential term ended. He left office with a dismal 33% approval rating and with 60% of the American public believing that he would be considered below average as president in the annals of history. When confronted with this situation, Bush wittily replied, "I was also the most popular president," which he was following his response to the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001. Upon leaving office, Bush returned to Midland, Texas, and promptly took up residence at his beloved Prairie Chapel Ranch in Crawford, Texas. No typical politician, he seemed to enjoy the relaxation and time away from power. Bush read several books about George Washington during the final year of his presidency and said that if historians were still analyzing the first president, then the 43rd would never fully discover how history viewed his own administration. Political advisor Karl Rove stated that despite the possibility of regrets, Bush has an inner confidence that what he did was right. After leaving office, Bush lived a quiet life in Texas and largely refrained from any connections to politics, particularly resisting opportunities to criticize his successor. George and Laura also bought a home in an exclusive Dallas neighborhood near Southern Methodist University. The former president quickly became a part of the Dallas community, attending local events and hosting barbecues at his home. He supplemented his income with paid speeches and was very involved with the George W. Bush Institute that he established at SMU. In his free time, he enjoyed biking, attending Texas Rangers baseball games, reading American history, and golfing. Inspired by a similar hobby of his hero Winston Churchill, Bush also began painting, primarily producing portraits of his pets and of world leaders that he came into contact with while serving as president. His paintings attracted national attention and were displayed in his presidential library. Bush worked quietly to solidify his legacy. The George W. Bush Presidential Center at SMU in Dallas consists of the Bush Presidential Library and Museum and the Bush Institute. The institute was created for the purpose of continuing discussions about the best policies to foster economic growth, human freedom, education, global health, and various women's initiatives. He also polished his legacy by publishing a memoir in 2010, Decision Points, which gave personal insight into his policy decisions and experiences as president. Bush's charity work was quite extensive, with several efforts devoted to fundraising for wounded veterans, including an annual 100-kilometer mountain bike ride and the Warrior Open golf tournament. He also took trips to Africa to raise awareness for cervical cancer, and was a strong advocate for veterans suffering from post-traumatic stress. In 2014, he surprised much of the publishing world by unveiling a previously secret project he had undertaken to write a biography of his father. 41 was published on Veterans Day, an appropriate date to celebrate his war hero father. Bush remarked about his life in retirement, "I think part of having a fulfilling life is to be challenged. I'm challenged on the golf course, I'm challenged to stay fit, and I'm challenged by my paintings, I am happy." The legacy of George W. Bush remains, much like his 2000 election, a subject of profound controversy, and any truly objective evaluation will likely be years in the future. He entered office as one of only a handful presidents to lose the nation's popular vote. The election of 2000 and the Supreme Court case of Bush v. Gore remain two of the most controversial political developments in the last half-century. Some thought that President Bush should begin his term by trying to find common ground and avoid controversy to take some of the edge off the nation's polarized politics coming out of the 2000 election. Instead, as one of his first actions, President Bush issued an executive order creating the Office of Faith-Based and Community Initiatives, which further alienated some who thought government money should not go to organizations affiliated with churches. Yet he did reach across the aisle on other issues, including the No Child Left Behind Act, which was the most impactful change in education policy in a generation. Within 9 months of taking office, President Bush was afforded the chance to unite the nation after the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001. By most accounts, Bush did a masterful job of speaking for and to the American people. His crisis leadership, including insisting on returning to the White House the night of the attacks instead of holing up in a safe bunker elsewhere, gave the American people confidence that someone was in charge. He became the most popular president in the history of polling, reaching an astounding 90% approval rating in the wake of the attacks. Following an authorization from Congress to eliminate those who perpetrated the attacks of 9/11, Bush ordered an invasion of Afghanistan. The Taliban leadership was driven into the mountains and across the borders into neighboring countries, including Pakistan. Those early successes, however, turned into the longest war in American history, and the president never was able to achieve the greatest symbolic goal of the effort, the killing or capturing of the mastermind of the attacks, Osama bin Laden. U.S. Special Forces achieved that goal in 2011 under Bush's successor, President Barack Obama. Following the 9/11 attacks, President Bush also presided over a restructuring of the American national security apparatus and the passage of the Patriot Act, which gave the government vast new powers in the effort to combat future acts of terror. Both efforts, especially the Patriot Act, sparked strong divisions within the American people throughout the Bush presidency. In 2002 and into 2003, Bush used the fear of further terrorist attacks to argue for a preemptive war on Saddam Hussein's Iraq under the rationale that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. The initial attacks and invasion were extremely successful and popular, but in the end no weapons of mass destruction were found anywhere in the country, and a strong insurgency arose that resulted in the deaths of more than 4,000 Americans over the next 8 years. The war grew increasingly unpopular, and the Democrats used it as a major wedge issue in the 2006 and 2008 elections, in which they first took over Congress and then the White House 2 years later. On the domestic front, the Bush presidency scored early successes in gaining passage of large tax reductions and a major reform of the American educational system with the No Child Left Behind Act. The tax cuts, however, were not made permanent, as the president wished, and the bipartisan education reforms proved very controversial with their emphasis on testing and school report cards. The tax cuts were eventually made permanent during budget negotiations in the Obama administration, but No Child Left Behind was eventually replaced with a new national education plan in 2015. After his re-election in 2004, Bush sought major changes to Social Security, arguing a partial privatization plan could ensure its solvency. He spent considerable political capital seeking such a change, but his efforts went nowhere in Congress. He also sought major immigration reforms that never materialized. As the tax cuts of 2001 reduced revenue to the government, while spending continued to increase partly due to the expensive wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the federal government racked up large deficits. Ultimately, those deficits, exacerbated by the financial recession of 2008, helped create a politically impactful insurgency on the political right that went under the banner of the Tea Party. The last few months of the Bush presidency were marked by a major crash of the stock market, a controversial bailout of financial institutions and car companies, and a recession that would wipe out millions of jobs and impact the U.S. economy for many years. The Bush presidency transformed American politics, its economy, and its place in the world, but not in ways that could have been predicted when the governor of Texas declared his candidacy for America's highest office. As president, Bush became a lightning rod for controversy. His controversial election and policies, especially the war in Iraq, deeply divided the American people. Arguably his greatest moment as president was his initial, heartfelt response to the tragedy of the 9/11 attacks. Soon, however, his administration was overshadowed by the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. President Bush's place in U.S. history will be debated and reconsidered for many years to come. Thank you for watching this video.